Maid's 500 IQ daughter solved $100 million problem that shocked the CEO. And what happened next stunned everyone. Harrison Cole, billionaire founder of Cole Biogenetics, stood before a wall of failed equations. "We're done," sighed his lead scientist. But Cole refused to let go. His wife had died of a cancer this project was meant to cure. The vision was bold, a microscopic, bioengineered craft that could slip through the bloodstream, bypass the body's defenses, and deliver medicine directly to diseased cells. A cure not just for cancer, but for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even genetic disorders. Yet every attempt collapsed. "It's no use, Harrison," one whispered. "The body rejects it. We've tried everything." Cole's jaw tightened. "Unviable," he growled. "This could have saved Eleanor's life. Don't tell me it's unviable." Outside the lab, a cleaning woman's daughter traced the diagrams on the glass with her eyes, then whispered, almost to herself, "You're building a submarine. You should be building a fish." What started as $100 million dream ended as something no one could have imagined. This is the story of how an invisible girl and an impossible idea changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A single line of debt on a bank statement can be a prison wall. For Susan Miller, that wall was 100 feet high, and for her daughter, it cast a very long shadow. The late afternoon sun cast long, tired stripes across the polished floors of Cole Biogenetics. The light, a faded gold, did little to warm the sterile white corridors. Here, even the sunbeams seemed to have their energy drained by the sheer weight of intellect and ambition contained within the building's glass walls. For Susan Miller, this light was simply a clock. It marked the time when the important people went home and her real work began. Her cleaning cart, with its rattling bottles and squeaking wheel, was a familiar sound in the evening quiet. It was the sound of her life, a rhythm of quiet persistence against a tide of debt that threatened to pull her under. Every spray of cleaner, every swipe of her mop, was a small act of defiance. It was a penny earned against the thousands she owed after her husband's long illness had taken everything but their small apartment and the stack of bills he left behind. The squeaking wheel was a lonely sound, a reminder that she was just a ghost in this machine, visible only after everyone else had gone. But tonight, she was not alone. Sitting on a worn chair just outside the main research laboratory was her daughter, Abigail. She was 12 years old, a girl with hair the color of spun gold, pulled back into a neat, practical braid. In her lap rested a book that seemed far too old and serious for a child. It was a faded olive green manual, its cover softened with age, its pages filled with the dense text and precise diagrams of a bygone era. It had been her great-grandfather's, a field guide from a war fought long before she was born. Abigail, or Abby as her mother called her, traced the lines of a diagram with a thoughtful finger, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't just looking at the book, she was conversing with it. Abby had to come with her mother this week. The elderly neighbor who usually watched her had taken a bad fall, and Susan couldn't afford to miss a single shift. Not with the final notices piling up, their red ink like little shouts of panic. So Abby became her mother's silent companion, a small, quiet presence in a world of microscopes and equations she wasn't meant to see. The rules were simple and unspoken. Be invisible. Touch nothing. Stay where your mother can see you. And Abby was good at the rules. She had a stillness about her, a way of observing the world that was uncommon in a child. She noticed the hum of the servers behind the walls, the way the dust motes danced in the projector beams, the faint smell of ozone from the powerful computers. Her teachers called her observant. Her mother knew it was something more. Abby didn't just see the world. She took it apart in her mind, piece by piece, trying to understand how it all fit together. Susan paused her work, her back sending a familiar throb of protest up her spine. She leaned on her mop for a moment and watched her daughter. A sad, gentle smile touched her lips. Abby never complained about their life. She never asked for the things other children had. All she ever asked for was stories about her great-grandfather, the man who had written his thoughts in the margins of that old green book. To Susan, he was a distant figure from family lore. To Abby, he was a teacher, a hero, a friend she had never met. "Just this last lab, sweetie," Susan whispered, her voice a soft echo in the empty hall. Then we can go home. Abby looked up, her blue eyes clear and full of a deep, unchildlike understanding. She nodded, her gaze lingering on her mother's tired face. She saw the worry etched around her mother's eyes, the way she sometimes rubbed her shoulder when she thought no one was looking. Abby wanted to fix it. She wanted to slay the dragon of debt that hounded her mother's steps. But she was just a 12-year-old girl. All she could do was be good, be quiet, and not be another burden. The main laboratory was different from the rest of the building. The air inside felt charged, buzzing with the ghosts of the day's frantic energy. Most of the lights were off, but a single large section at the far end of the room was still brightly lit. It was a glass-walled enclosure, a room within a room, known to the staff as the Crucible. Inside, a small group of people remained. They were the top minds of coal biogenetics, and they looked utterly defeated. Papers and empty coffee cups littered a massive conference table. At the center of it all, standing before a floor-to-ceiling whiteboard, was the man who owned it all, Harrison Cole. He was a man built of sharp angles and restless energy, but tonight, he seemed to be crumbling. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie loosened. He stared intently at the whiteboard, which was a chaotic storm of biochemical equations, cellular diagrams, and fluid dynamics calculations. Angry red lines and frustrated scribbles slashed through months of work. His hands were braced against the board as if he were trying to physically hold the failing project together. Susan had seen Mr. Cole before, usually in passing. He always radiated an aura of immense power and control. He was a force of nature, a titan of industry. Tonight, he just looked like a man drowning in plain sight. Abby had stood up and walked quietly to her mother's side, her small hand finding its way into Susan's. She peered into the crucible, her eyes skipping past the exhausted scientists. Her gaze landed on the whiteboard, her head tilted. To her, it wasn't a mess of incomprehensible symbols. It was a map of a failed invasion. Inside the room, the mood was grim. "It's no use, Harrison," a man said, his voice ragged with fatigue. He was Robert Jennings, the lead biologist on the project, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his haircut. "The simulations are consistent. We can't get past the body's defenses. The moment the craft enters the bloodstream, the immune system tags it and destroys it. We've tried a dozen different stealth coatings. Nothing works. The biofouling is immediate. It's a fundamental rejection." Harrison Cole did not turn. His eyes were fixed on one diagram in the center of the board. It was a sleek, microscopic craft, shaped like a tiny torpedo. This was the Nautilus, his $100 million gamble. It was a bioengineered vessel designed to navigate the labyrinth of the human bloodstream. Its purpose was to deliver life-saving medicine directly to a single diseased cell, leaving healthy cells untouched. It was a key that could unlock a cure for a dozen different kinds of cancer, for Alzheimer's, for diseases that had stolen lives with brutal indifference. It was more than a project. It was a crusade. "The design is sound," Harrison said, his voice a low growl. "The propulsion system works. The delivery mechanism is flawless. We are failing at the front door." "The front door is a fortress," Jennings countered, a note of finality in his tone. "Maybe it's time we admit this fortress can't be breached. At least, not this way. We can report to the board that the core concept is unviable." Harrison finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Jennings flinch. It was a look of cold, raw grief. "Unviable." Harrison repeated, the word tasting like ash. "My wife, Eleanor, died from a cancer this craft could have cured. She died because the medicine that might have saved her killed the rest of her body first. You stand there and you talk to me about what is viable." The room fell silent. The story of Eleanor Cole was known to everyone in the company. She was the reason Harrison had poured his life and fortune into this project. The Nautilus wasn't about profit. It was a monument to a memory. It was the last battle in a war he had already lost, the one to save his wife. And now he was losing this one, too. "The FDA review is in 2 weeks, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. 2 weeks. If we don't show them a viable path to success, they will pull our clinical trial permits. The funding will dry up. It will all be over." He walked to the glass wall and stared out into the darkened lab, seeing nothing. He looked like a king surveying a ruined kingdom. Outside in the hall, Susan felt a pang of deep sympathy. She knew what it was like to watch a loved one fade away, to feel that helpless rage against a disease that would not listen to reason. She began to pull her daughter gently away. This was a private grief, a pain too sacred for them to witness. "Come on, Abby. Let's finish up." But Abby did not move. Her eyes were locked on the whiteboard, her mind racing. She saw the torpedo shape of the Nautilus. She saw the arrows representing the immune system, the body's soldiers, attacking it from all sides. The engineers were trying to build a better battleship, a stronger shield, a faster engine. They were trying to win a fight. But her great-grandfather's notes weren't just about fighting. He had been a master of infiltration, of camouflage. He wrote about how a single soldier could slip past an entire army, not by fighting, but by becoming invisible, by looking like something that belonged there. They weren't trying to invade a foreign country. They were trying to walk through a crowded city. You don't wear armor. You wear the local clothing. You don't fight. You hide. You become a friend. Abby pulled her hand from her mother's. She took a single, small step toward the door of the crucible. Her heart thumped in her chest, a tiny, determined drum. "Abby, no," Susan whispered, her voice tight with alarm. "Don't. We can't bother them." But the idea was too big, too bright to be held back. It had to be spoken. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but it cut through the silence with the simple, unwavering confidence of someone who sees an answer with perfect clarity. "You're fighting it," she said. "You should be hiding." The words were so soft, they were almost swallowed by the vast, empty space. But Robert Jennings heard them. He turned, his face a mask of irritation at the interruption. He saw the cleaning lady, her face pale with apology, and the little girl standing beside her. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, it seems we have a consultant," he said to the others, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Susan rushed forward, her hands finding Abby's shoulders. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice trembling with fear. She could be fired for this. She's just a child. She didn't mean anything. We're leaving right now. I am so sorry. She tried to pull Abby away, but the girl stood her ground. Her gaze went past the annoyed face of Jennings and settled on Harrison Cole, who had turned from the window. He wasn't looking at her with anger. His face was a hollow mask of exhaustion, but in his eyes, there was a flicker of something else. A deep, weary curiosity. What could a child possibly say that his team of geniuses hadn't already thought of? "What did you say?" Harrison asked. His voice was tired, but it carried an authority that silenced the room. Abby took a small breath. She pointed a finger at the torpedo-shaped craft on the whiteboard. "It looks like a threat," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "It looks like something that doesn't belong. That's why the body soldiers are fighting it. You're building a submarine. You should be building a fish." A ripple of exhausted disbelief went through the small group. One of the engineers stifled a cynical laugh. Jennings's face hardened. "This is insane," he snapped. "Harrison, we are on the verge of $100 million failure. We don't have time for nursery rhymes from the janitor's daughter." "Let her speak," Harrison said, his voice sharp. He walked slowly toward the glass door, his gaze fixed on Abby. He saw the strange, focused seriousness in her blue eyes. He saw the ancient military manual clutched in her other hand. For months, he had listened to the most brilliant minds in biotechnology. They had given him algorithms, protein chains, and molecular dynamics. And they had all led him to this dead end. His dream was already shattered. What more could he possibly lose by listening to a child? He looked at Susan, who looked as if she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. "It's all right," he said gently. Then he looked back at Abby. "What do you mean, a fish?" Abby took a step closer to the glass. "Not a real fish," she explained. "Something that looks like it belongs. Something the soldiers ignore because it looks like a friend. Like a red blood cell. Or something else that's supposed to be there. It needs a disguise." Disguise. The word was so simple, so out of place in their world of complex chemical coatings and immunosuppressant surfaces. "A disguise," Jennings repeated, his voice laced with open contempt. "Brilliant. Why didn't we think of that? Let's just paint a smiley face on it. This is a complete waste of time. I'm going home." He started to gather his tablet and notes, his frustration boiling over. But Harrison Cole wasn't listening to him. He was listening to a memory. Eleanor, in the final weeks, weak but her mind still sharp, looking at the early schematics for the Nautilus. "It's so aggressive, Harry," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of paper. It looks like you're invading. Medicine shouldn't be an invasion. It should be a quiet helper, a friend who slips in unnoticed. His breath caught. He stared at the aggressive, alien shape on the whiteboard. He looked back at the little girl with the old book. It was an act of pure, desperate intuition. A leap of faith from a man with nothing left to lose. He slid open the heavy glass door to the crucible. The hushed, pressurized air of the lab spilled out into the hall. He knelt down, bringing his powerful frame down to Abby's level. The billionaire CEO, kneeling on the marble floor before the cleaning lady's daughter. The rest of the team watched, stunned into silence. "Show me," Harrison Cole said, his voice thick with an emotion no one could name. "Show me how to build a fish." The room held its breath. Susan stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild mix of terror and a tiny, unbelievable flicker of pride. Her quiet, thoughtful Abby was not afraid. She was looking at the powerful, grieving man with a solemn understanding that defied her age. She walked past Harrison, her worn sneakers making no sound on the floor. She walked directly to the massive whiteboard that had become a monument to failure. She reached up, but her fingers could only brush the very bottom edge. Without a word, Harrison stood and retrieved a heavy chair, placing it in front of the board. "Here," he said softly. Abby climbed onto the chair. She surveyed the chaos of equations. She ignored them all, her eyes searching for a clean space. Jennings watched, his arms crossed, a look of pure disgust on his face. "I cannot believe this is happening," he muttered to the engineer next to him. Abby reached into the pocket of her jeans. She didn't pull out a crayon. She pulled out a simple black marker she'd found on the floor earlier in the evening, one that had rolled under a desk. It was dry, but she shook it hard, and the tip darkened. She turned her back to the room and faced the board. She took a deep breath. She wasn't thinking about the $100 million problem. She was thinking about a chapter in her great-grandfather's book. Chapter 7, Infiltration and Deception. It spoke of mimicry and blending with the environment. She began to draw. She didn't draw another torpedo. She drew something soft, something organic. It was a simple, disc-like shape, like a red blood cell. But then she drew a second layer around it, a shimmering, shifting shell. She drew small arrows pointing to it and wrote 2 words. Protein shell. Then she drew another arrow, pointing from the shell to a list of other cells. Copies host. Next to that, she drew a simple sequence. The craft approaching a larger circle, she labeled target cell. Then she showed the craft shedding its outer shell, revealing the torpedo-like delivery system underneath. The torpedo then docked with the target cell. It was a Trojan horse. It was not a battleship storming the beach. It was a spy, cloaked in a friendly uniform, walking straight through the front gate. When she was finished, she didn't turn to the skeptical engineers. She turned to Harrison. "There," she said simply. "It doesn't fight the soldiers. It wears their uniform. It makes them think it's a friend, just passing by. It only shows its real face when it reaches the one door it's meant to open." The room was utterly silent. The remaining engineers stared at the childishly simple drawing. It lacked any mathematical rigor. It ignored 100 known obstacles. On the surface, it was absurd. Jennings was the first to break the silence, his voice a condescending drawl. "It wears their uniform? That's the solution? We're supposed to build a costume for a nanobot. This is unscientific gibberish." He walked to the board and tapped a dismissive finger on Abby's drawing. A mutable protein shell? The complexity of mimicking a host cell's protein signature in real time it's computationally impossible. It would require an onboard AI we can't build for another 20 years. It's a fantasy. Another engineer nodded in agreement. "He's right, sir. The concept is elegant, but the practical application is beyond our current technology. It's a nice idea, but it's not engineering." But Harrison Cole's mind was racing. He was stripping away the layers of his own complex knowledge, trying to see it as the child did. Not as an impossible problem, but as a simple answer. "Don't fight. Hide." Eleanor's words. A friend who slips in unnoticed. They had been so focused on creating a perfect shield, they had never considered creating the perfect disguise. They had been trying to build a key to pick the lock, when the answer was to have a key that the lock already recognized. "Robert," Harrison said, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes never leaving the drawing. "You say it's computationally impossible. Are you certain?" "Of course, I'm certain," Jennings said with a huff. I've run the numbers 1,000 times. The processing power required. You've run the numbers for a rigid system, Harrison interrupted, a new energy sparking in his voice. One that has to fight and adapt to every threat. What if it doesn't have to think? What if it just has to copy? Like a chameleon. It doesn't understand the jungle. It just reflects the color of the leaf it's sitting on. It's a passive system. A mirror. He looked at the youngest engineer in the room, a woman named Grace who had been silent through the whole exchange. Grace, run a new simulation. Forget the active stealth coatings. Model a passive mimicry system. A shell that simply samples and replicates the protein markers of its immediate environment. Assume we can solve the processing problem later. Just run the simulation. I want to see what the body does when it sees a friend, not a foe. Grace looked stunned, but also intrigued. A simulation of that? She asked, gesturing to Abby's drawing. Yes, Harrison said. Exactly as she drew it. The Trojan horse. Show me what happens. Jennings threw his hands up. This is a waste of resources. It will take hours to model. Hours we don't have to test a child's drawing. Then you are welcome to leave, Robert, Harrison said, his voice now cold as ice. But the rest of us have work to do. I want to see what happens when we stop trying to be soldiers and start trying to be spies. A change happened in the room. The cynicism began to fade, replaced by a nervous, fragile curiosity. Grace nodded, a spark of excitement in her eyes. Yes, sir. Right away. She hurried to her terminal, her fingers beginning to fly across the keyboard. Robert Jennings stood there, his face a thundercloud of fury and humiliation. He had been overruled. His expertise had been dismissed. And he had been replaced, in this single, pivotal moment, by a 12-year-old girl and her simple, impossible idea. He shot a look of pure venom at Abby, then at her mother. Without another word, he grabbed his things and stormed out of the crucible, the glass doors swinging shut behind him with a sharp, angry thud. Susan watched from the doorway, her hand over her mouth. She didn't understand the science, but she understood the look on Mr. Cole's face. It was the look of a man who had just been thrown a lifeline. Hope. Abby was still on the chair, her small legs dangling. She watched Grace at the computer, then looked at Harrison, who now stood beside her, a guardian watching over her drawing. Why that book? He asked her quietly, nodding toward the old green manual she still held. Abby looked down at it, her fingers tracing the worn cover. It was my great-grandfather's, she said. He was a soldier. But he said the smartest soldiers aren't the ones who fight the best. They're the ones who make sure they never have to fight at all. Harrison looked from the girl to her drawing, and for the first time in a very long time, a real, unburdened smile touched his eyes. He had spent $100 million on the best equipment and the brightest minds. And the answer, the whole time, might have been sitting in a little girl's lap, in the faded pages of a book written by a wise old soldier. The hours crawled by. The sky outside turned from black to the deep, bruised purple of pre-dawn. No one left the lab. A new energy, quiet and focused, filled the space. Grace and two other engineers worked feverishly, translating Abby's concept into the unforgiving language of code. Susan had brought Abby a blanket from a storage closet. The girl had finally fallen asleep in the big chair, her head pillowed on her arm, the old green book resting in her lap. She was a small island of peace in a sea of frantic activity. Finally, as the first hint of morning light touched the windows, Grace leaned back from her screen. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were wide and bright. It's done, she announced, her voice a shaky whisper. The simulation is ready. The room went still. Everyone gathered behind her, their eyes fixed on the massive monitor on the wall. Harrison gently shook Abby's shoulder. Wake up, little spy, he whispered. I think you'll want to see this. Abby's eyes fluttered open. She looked at the big screen. It showed a magnified, digital recreation of a human artery. And floating in the virtual current was the Nautilus. But it looked different now. It was a soft, disc-like shape, shimmering and indistinct, just as she had drawn it. Running the failure scenario, Grace said, her voice tense. Maximum immune response. This is the test that killed the project every single time before. From the corner of the room, a voice dripped with scorn. Robert Jennings had not left. He had been lurking in the shadows of the lab, unable to walk away, needing to see this fantasy collapse. Get ready to watch your little ghost get busted, Harrison. Harrison ignored him. He placed a steadying hand on Abby's shoulder. "Run it, Grace." Grace hit the enter key. On the screen, the new Nautilus moved with the current. It was almost invisible, its shell flickering as it perfectly matched the cells around it. The numbers on the side of the screen, tracking the body's immune response, stayed flat. "All green. Here they come," someone whispered. Digital shapes representing the body's defense mechanisms, the soldiers, began to swarm the area. In every previous simulation, this was the moment of attack. The moment the alarms would blare red. The immune cells swept through the area. They moved past the Nautilus. Around it. Through it. They didn't even see it. It was just another piece of the landscape to them, a friendly face in the crowd. It was being completely, utterly ignored. The room was filled with the sound of held breath. The Nautilus continued on its path, unimpeded. It reached the target cell. Its outer shell dissolved, and the smaller, purposeful craft within emerged. It docked perfectly. Mission accomplished. The numbers on the screen remained green. Stable. Secure. Successful. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound, deafening stillness. The engineers stared, their mouths open. Jennings's face was the color of ash, his smug certainty shattered into a million pieces. It defied all his logic. It defied his entire career. Grace was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion. It worked. The whisper broke the spell. The room didn't erupt in cheers, but in gasps of pure, unadulterated shock. The engineers turned to each other, their faces lit with a dawning sense of wonder. They were looking at the impossible, made real. Harrison felt his hand tremble on Abby's shoulder. He looked down at the child, who was watching the screen with a simple, knowing smile. Of course it worked. You don't fight family. He then looked at his team, their faces transformed from defeat to glorious disbelief. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. It wasn't just relief. It was the humbling, earth-shattering realization that he had been searching for his answer in the wrong universe entirely. He had been listening to calculations when he should have been listening to a story. He knelt again in front of Abby, his eyes shining with tears he didn't bother to hide. How do you thank someone who has just handed you back your life's purpose? How do you thank a child who has just honored your wife's memory in a way you never could? "Thank you, Abby," he whispered, his voice thick. "You didn't just give us an idea. You reminded us how to think." He stood and faced the room. His authority returned, tenfold. "Grace," he said, his voice ringing with new command. "You are the new lead on this project. I want a prototype built based on this model. The Trojan horse. Effective immediately." Then, his eyes, hard as steel, found Robert Jennings in the corner. "Robert, you're fired. I want you out of this building in the next 5 minutes. I have no room for a man whose ego is bigger than his imagination." He then turned to Susan, who was now weeping silently, tears of shock and joy and overwhelming relief streaming down her face. "And Madam," Harrison Cole said, his voice now filled with a deep, profound respect, "I believe your daughter has just earned you a promotion. I think we'll need a parent on site. We're creating a new department at this company, the Department of Inspired Solutions, and I'd like you to be its first director." The world, for Susan and Abby Miller, tilted on its axis. The long shadow of debt and despair evaporated in the bright, sudden light of a new morning. Outside the windows of Cole Biogenetics, the sun was rising, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a promise. The announcement hung in the air, as stunning and absolute as the successful simulation on the screen. Director. The word echoed in Susan's mind, a foreign term from a world she had only ever viewed from the outside, with a mop and a bucket. She looked at her work-worn hands, then at the powerful, earnest face of Harrison Cole. It felt like a dream, a beautiful, impossible dream that she was afraid to breathe on for fear it might shatter. The engineers, caught in the undertow of Harrison's decisive actions, began to move. Grace, her face a mixture of shock and a dawning, fierce determination, approached Harrison. "Sir," she began, her voice still shaky, I don't know what to say. The lead on the project. "You know what to do, Grace," Harrison said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You understood the vision. You didn't let your ego get in the way of the answer. That's what I need now. Not pride. Just progress. Build the prototype. Spare no expense. I want a working model by the end of the week." His eyes then fell on Robert Jennings, who was still frozen in his corner, his face a mask of disbelief that was slowly hardening into a cold, calculated fury. Security guards, summoned by a discreet text from Harrison, appeared at the lab doors. They were large men with quiet feet, their presence a stark and final statement. "Mr. Jennings," one of the guards said, his voice polite but firm. "If you'll come with us." Jennings didn't move. He stared at Harrison, then his gaze shifted, landing with a chilling intensity on Abby, who instinctively shrank back behind her mother. It was a look that promised retribution. It was the look of a man who had not been defeated, but merely inconvenienced. He had been publicly humiliated, his career at Cole Biogenetics vaporized in an instant. But a man like Robert Jennings, whose entire identity was built on the foundation of his own perceived brilliance, did not simply accept such a fate. In his mind, this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a new war. Without another word, he turned and walked with the guards, his back ramrod straight. The click of the lab door shutting behind him was the only sound. The tension in the room finally broke. The remaining team members let out a collective sigh, the adrenaline of the last few hours giving way to a bone-deep weariness and a giddy, disbelieving joy. They had been on the brink of catastrophic failure. Now, they were on the cusp of the greatest medical breakthrough of the century. Harrison turned his full attention back to Susan and Abby. "Well, Director Miller," he said, a gentle warmth returning to his voice. "Your first official duty is to get some rest. Both of you." He gestured to a sleek black car that had pulled up outside the main entrance, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. "My driver will take you home. Your new employment contract and a company credit card will be delivered to your apartment by noon. Your salary will be substantial, enough to make any walls of debt disappear." Susan could only nod, tears blurring her vision. She clutched Abby's hand, the small, steady warmth a comfort against the overwhelming strangeness of it all. "And Abby," Harrison said, crouching down once more. He looked at the girl who had seen the answer he and his team had missed. "You've taught me a valuable lesson tonight. Never underestimate the power of a fresh perspective. Your great-grandfather would be very proud." He glanced at the green book still held in her hand. "I'd be honored if you'd let me borrow that book sometime." Abby smiled, a real, bright smile this time. "You can," she said, "but you have to read the chapter on camouflage first." Harrison laughed, a genuine, booming laugh that echoed in the lab. It was a sound that hadn't been heard in these halls for a very long time. "It's a deal," he said. The ride home was a silent, dreamlike blur. As the car whispered through the waking city, Susan kept looking at her daughter, who was staring out the window, watching the world go by as if it were any other day. But it wasn't any other day. Everything was different. The weight that had settled on Susan's shoulders for years, a constant, crushing presence, had lifted. She felt so light she was afraid she might float away. When they got back to their small, cramped apartment, the first thing Susan did was walk to the little kitchen table where the stack of bills sat. She picked up the topmost one, a final notice from the bank, its red letters a glaring accusation. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she tore it in half. And then in half again. One by one, she ripped up the symbols of her prison until all that was left was a small pile of confetti on the table. She was free. Her daughter had set her free. Meanwhile, in a sterile, minimalist apartment overlooking the city, Robert Jennings was not sleeping. He paced his living room like a caged animal, the fury from his humiliation churning into a cold, sharp-edged plan. He was not a fool. He knew he was finished at Cole Biogenetics. But Harrison Cole and his company were not the only players in the game. The idea, the simple, infuriatingly brilliant idea of cellular mimicry, was now out in the open. And it was an idea worth billions. His mind replayed the scene in the lab. The child's clumsy drawing. The naive talk of hiding and disguises. It was simplistic. It was nursery school logic. But it had worked. The simulation was undeniable. The problem, as Jennings saw it, was the narrative. A 12-year-old girl, the daughter of a cleaner, saves the day with a flash of childish insight. It was a fairy tale. It was sentimental nonsense. The world of high-stakes science and corporate investment did not run on fairy tales. It ran on data, on credentials, on polished presentations, and the authority of experts. Experts like him. He could reshape the narrative. He sat down at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He began to write, not a letter of resignation, but a proposal. He meticulously reconstructed Abby's idea, but he stripped it of its storybook origins. He cloaked it in the complex, impenetrable jargon of his field. He didn't call it a disguise. He called it a dynamically adaptive protein-mimicking shell. He didn't talk about hiding from soldiers. He wrote of bypassing the body's immunogenic response through homologous surface protein replication. He built a fortress of scientific language around the simple, elegant core of Abby's idea. He created charts, graphs, and theoretical projections. He backdated notes in his digital files, creating a false trail of research that suggested he had been working on this very concept for months. He would frame it as a parallel development, a breakthrough he had been on the verge of announcing before he was so rudely interrupted by a flight of fancy in the lab. He would say Harrison, in his grief and desperation, had latched onto a child's fantasy, but that he, Robert Jennings, had arrived at the real, scientifically viable version of the solution. He knew exactly who to take it to. Syntec, Harrison Cole's biggest and most ruthless competitor. They would love nothing more than to beat Cole to the market with his own stolen technology. All Jennings needed was to make the idea his. And in his mind, it already was. He was the one with the PhD. He was the one with the decades of experience. The girl had simply been a random, nonsensical catalyst. He had taken her childish scrawl and turned it into science. He had taken her lump of clay and molded it into a masterpiece. Surely, that made it his. By sunrise, his proposal was complete. It was a work of brilliant, calculated theft, a masterpiece of intellectual fraud. He attached it to an email addressed to the CEO of Syntec, a man he knew personally, a man with a reputation for rewarding ambition, no matter how it was acquired. The subject line was simple, a solution to the Cole problem. He hit send. The first shot in his new war had been fired. Susan Miller's first day as the director of Inspired Solutions was one of the most terrifying experiences of her life. She arrived at Cole Biogenetics not through the service entrance, but through the grand front lobby. She wasn't wearing her worn work uniform, but a simple, new dress she had bought that morning with a tremor in her hands. The security guard at the front desk, a man who had never given her a second glance, now stood up and greeted her with a respectful, "Good morning, Director Miller." Her office was on the top floor, next to Harrison Cole's. It was a corner office with sweeping views of the city. It was bigger than her entire apartment. It had a large mahogany desk, a soft leather chair, and a vase of fresh lilies on the windowsill. There was a plaque on the door with her name on it. Susan Miller, Director, Department of Inspired Solutions. She spent the first hour just standing in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, certain that at any moment someone would tap her on the shoulder and tell her there had been a terrible mistake. Harrison found her there when he came in. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He smiled, seeing the look of bewildered panic on her face. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" he said gently, handing her a cup. "Mr. Cole, I can't do this," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm a cleaner. I don't know anything about directing things. I don't have a degree. I barely finished high school." "Susan," Harrison said, his voice calm and steady. "You have something more important than a degree. You have humility. For months, I've been surrounded by the smartest people in the world, and all they could do was tell me why my idea was impossible. Their pride, their certainty, it made them blind. They were all trying to be the smartest person in the room." He took a sip of his coffee. "Your job, as the director of this department, is simple. It is to listen. It is to find the people who aren't trying to be the smartest, but are just trying to find the answer. It is to protect the Abby Millers of the world from the Robert Jenningses." He gestured to the chair behind the desk. "Your first task is to make this place feel like your own. Your second is to manage your daughter's consulting fee. I'm setting up a trust for her education. A very, very large one. She will never have to worry about money a day in her life. She can study whatever she wants, wherever she wants. And when she's ready, she'll have a permanent home here, if she wants it." He paused, a more serious look on his face. "But there's a third thing, and it's important. Robert Jennings is gone, but the thinking that he represents is not. There will be people in this company who will be resentful. They will say this is a fluke. They will try to undermine you. They will try to reclaim the narrative. Your job is to be the guardian of this story, to remind us all that the most brilliant solutions can come from the most unexpected places. Susan sat down in the soft leather chair. It felt like sinking into a cloud. She looked out the vast window at the city spread below her. For her entire life, she had been invisible, cleaning up the messes left behind by other people. Now, she had been asked to sit at the table. Not because of what she knew, but because of who she was, a mother who had raised a daughter to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. "Okay, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice finding a new, quiet strength. "I'll try." "Harrison," he corrected her with a smile. "We're colleagues now." Down in the main lab, the atmosphere was electric. Grace, now in charge, was directing her team with a newfound confidence. They were no longer trying to solve an impossible problem. They were building an elegant solution. They worked with a joyful intensity, the memory of the successful simulation pushing them forward. Abby's simple drawing was no longer on the main whiteboard. It had been carefully moved to a smaller one and placed in a position of honor in the center of the lab, a constant reminder of their new direction. No one mentioned Robert Jennings. It was as if a toxic cloud had been lifted from the room. His brand of cynical, ego-driven science had been replaced by a collaborative, open-minded spirit of discovery. But across the city, in the gleaming headquarters of Syntech, that toxic cloud was beginning to reform. Jennings's email had landed on the desk of a man who saw the world not in terms of science or humanity, but in terms of market share and competitive advantage. He read Jennings's proposal, his eyes gleaming with predatory interest. The science was dense, but the opportunity was crystal clear. It was a key to $1 billion kingdom, and Robert Jennings was handing it to him on a silver platter. He picked up his phone. "Get me Robert Jennings," he said to his assistant. "Tell him I've read his proposal. And I'm very, very interested." The battle for the Nautilus was not over. It had just begun, and the soul of the invention, the simple, honest truth of its origin, was now in danger of being lost forever, buried under a mountain of lies. Harrison Cole had a solution, but he was about to discover he had a much bigger problem. A problem of a stolen story. A problem that would threaten to unravel everything. And he would soon realize that to save his company, he would need more than a scientific breakthrough. He would need to prove that a little girl with an old book was not just a fairy tale, but the undeniable, unshakable truth. The next 2 days at Cole Biogenetics were filled with a quiet, focused joy. The dark cloud of failure had been replaced by the bright, clean light of purpose. In the main lab, Grace and her team worked with an almost religious fervor. The Trojan horse, as it was now affectionately called, was moving from a simulation to a physical reality with astonishing speed. Microfabricators hummed, and complex protein chains were synthesized. The energy was that of a team that knew they were no longer just doing a job. They were building a miracle. Susan, meanwhile, navigated her new reality with a sense of profound unreality. She spent hours in her vast, quiet office, not directing, but learning. She read every file on the Nautilus project, not to understand the complex science, but to understand the story, the people, the years of hope and frustration that had led to that one fateful night. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was becoming its heart, the keeper of its most important memory. Abby came to the office with her after school. She was no longer relegated to a chair in the hallway. She had a small desk in her mother's office, where she did her homework. But often, she would be invited down to the lab. The engineers, who had once viewed her with tired skepticism, now treated her with a gentle, profound respect. They would show her the progress on the prototype, explaining in simple terms how her drawing was coming to life. They called her their secret weapon. Abby would listen quietly, a small, solemn smile on her face, her presence a constant, grounding reminder of why their work now felt so different, so right. It was on the third day that the world broke. Harrison Cole was in his office, looking over the preliminary designs for the prototype, when his phone buzzed. It was a news alert from a major financial journal. The headline was a gut punch. Syntech announces revolutionary breakthrough in nanomedicine. Unveils the chameleon. Harrison's blood ran cold. He clicked the link. The article was accompanied by a picture of a smirking Robert Jennings, standing beside Marcus Thorne, the notoriously predatory CEO of Syntech. The article was filled with quotes from Jennings, who claimed to have been working on a paradigm-shifting concept for the past year. He described a bionanite capable of dynamic environmental mimicry, a craft that could cloak itself in the body's own cellular language to evade the immune system. It was Abby's idea. Her beautiful, simple, world-changing idea, twisted and repackaged in the arrogant, self-serving language of a thief. They're calling it the chameleon, Harrison whispered to the empty room, the words tasting like poison. The name was a confession. It was a direct, cynical theft of the core concept. His intercom buzzed. It was his head of legal. Harrison, have you seen the news? Syntech filed a comprehensive patent portfolio this morning. It covers everything. It's the Trojan horse. They've stolen it. Harrison stood up and walked to the window, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The view of the city, which had seemed so full of promise just moments before, now looked gray and hostile. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was a violation. Jennings hadn't just stolen a blueprint. He had stolen a piece of magic and was trying to sell it as a cheap trick. He had taken a story about a little girl and her great-grandfather and was trying to erase it from the world, replacing it with a lie about his own solitary genius. Get everyone in the boardroom in 5 minutes, Harrison said, his voice dangerously calm. Grace, her team, and get Susan Miller. Now, the mood in the boardroom was funereal. The team, who had been riding a wave of exhilarating success, now looked shocked and betrayed. The news article was projected onto the large screen at the front of the room, Jennings's triumphant face mocking them. How? Grace asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. How could he do this? He was here. He heard the girl. He saw the drawing. How can he claim this as his own? Because he's a narcissist who believes any idea in his vicinity belongs to him, Harrison said, his voice cutting through the room like a shard of glass. He's banking on the world believing the story of a celebrated scientist over the story of a cleaning lady's daughter. And in our world, that's usually a safe bet. He looked at Susan, who was sitting at the long mahogany table, her face pale. She looked terrified, but also something else, resolute. She was no longer just a cleaner caught in the crossfire. She was the director of Inspired Solutions, and her daughter's inspiration had just been stolen. Susan, Harrison said, his tone softening slightly. I'm sorry to put you through this, but you were there. You are the most important witness we have. I need you to tell us everything you remember about that night. Every detail, no matter how small. Susan took a deep breath. She looked around the table at the defeated faces. She remembered the fear of that night, the terror that she would be fired. But she also remembered the look in Abby's eyes, that clear, unwavering confidence. Her daughter had not been afraid then, and she would not be afraid for her now. He called her a consultant, Susan began, her voice quiet but steady. He was sarcastic. He said they didn't have time for nursery rhymes from the janitor's daughter. He was angry. He couldn't see the answer because he was too proud to listen. She recounted every detail, Jennings's dismissal, Harrison's intervention, Abby's simple explanation, the drawing on the whiteboard. As she spoke, the narrative of the night solidified, becoming a tangible thing in the room. It was the truth. He said it was unscientific gibberish, Susan finished, her eyes meeting Harrison's. Those were his exact words. Harrison nodded slowly. Thank you, Susan. That's exactly what we needed to hear. He turned back to the rest of the team. He didn't just steal the what. He stole the how. The very origin of the idea is what proves the theft. Syntech and Jennings have built their entire claim on a lie. A lie about a lone genius having a sudden breakthrough. But breakthroughs don't happen that way. They happen when someone is humble enough to see a simple truth everyone else has missed. He paced the room, a new fire in his eyes. They want to fight a patent war? Fine. We'll give them a war. But we're not going to fight them in the courtroom. Not at first. We're going to fight them in the press. We're going to fight them with the truth. We are going to tell the world the real story of the Trojan horse. We're going to tell them about Abby. A murmur of uncertainty went through the room. Exposing a 12-year-old girl to a brutal corporate media storm? It felt wrong. Harrison, is that wise? Grace asked tentatively. She's a child. They'll tear her apart. They'll call her a prop, a publicity stunt. They will try, Harrison agreed. Which is why we have to be very, very careful. But they have left us no choice. They have made the origin of this idea the entire battlefield. If we let his lie stand, we don't just lose a patent. We lose our soul. We let the world believe that ideas only come from men in lab coats, not from anywhere else. We dishonor the very spirit of the breakthrough. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Susan. This has to be your choice, Susan. And Abby's. I will not force either of you to do this. We can fight this legally, behind the scenes. It will be a long, ugly, and uncertain battle. Or, we can tell the truth, publicly. It will be fast, brutal, and just as uncertain. But I believe it's the only way to win. Susan thought of her daughter, sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that a war was about to be fought over her beautiful mind. She thought of the condescending sneer on Robert Jennings's face. She thought of the pile of shredded bills on her kitchen table. This wasn't just about a patent. It was about justice. It was about her daughter's name. "We'll do it," Susan said, her voice filled with a mother's fierce, protective certainty. "He will not get away with this. He will not steal my daughter's story." Harrison nodded, a look of profound gratitude on his face. "Good," he said. "Then that's what we'll do." His eyes then drifted to the window, a thought beginning to form. But a story is only as strong as its proof. It's not just her word against his. He turned back to Susan. "That book," he said. "The one Abby was holding that night. Her great-grandfather's military manual. Does she still have it?" "Of course," Susan said. "She never lets it out of her sight." "I need to see it," Harrison said, the urgency clear in his voice. "I need to see the chapter that gave her the idea. I need to see the soldier's words." He realized, in that moment, that their most powerful weapon in this billion-dollar war of technology and lies wasn't a patent lawyer or a PR firm. It was a faded, olive-green book, filled with the quiet, timeless wisdom of a man who understood that the greatest victories are won not by fighting, but by hiding. The war for the Nautilus was about to begin, and it would be fought and won with the ghost of a long-dead veteran as its silent, commanding general. That evening, Harrison's driver brought Susan and Abby to his personal study, a quiet room lined with books. Abby, with a calm that still astonished Harrison, placed the worn, olive-green book on his desk. It lay there not as an old manual, but as the source code of their miracle. Harrison handled it with reverence. The pages were thin, the ink faded, but the margins were filled with a soldier's elegant, precise handwriting. "Show me, Abby," he said softly. She turned to Chapter 7. Infiltration and Deception. She pointed to a paragraph. Harrison leaned in to read the handwritten note beside it. The printed text described using enemy uniforms to slip past sentries. But the handwritten note offered a deeper philosophy. "A uniform is not just cloth," he had written. "It is a story. It tells the guard, I am one of you. The goal is not to be invisible, but to be unremarkable. To be so perfectly a part of the landscape that the eye passes over you without a second thought. The best disguise is not a mask, but a friendly face." Harrison read the words, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was it. The entire concept, the soul of the idea, written decades ago by a wise man in the middle of a war. It was irrefutable proof. This idea wasn't born in a sterile lab. It was born from a story, passed down from a great-grandfather to a little girl. "He would have liked you," Abby said quietly. "He liked people who listened." Harrison felt a lump form in his throat. "I think I would have liked him too." He looked at Susan, his eyes conveying absolute certainty. "We're ready." 2 days later, Cole Biogenetics held a press conference. The room was packed, buzzing with anticipation for Harrison's response to Synteca's move. They expected a dry statement from lawyers. They got something else entirely. Harrison walked to the podium alone. 2 weeks ago, he began, my company was on the verge of $100 million failure. Our most important project was dead. He paused, letting the admission of failure hang in the air. Then, one night, we had a breakthrough. It wasn't an equation. It was an idea. A beautifully simple idea. To stop fighting the body's defenses and, instead, to hide from them. To build not a submarine, but a spy, cloaked in a friendly uniform. He saw a flicker of recognition in the reporter's eyes. Yesterday, Harrison continued, his voice hardening. Our competitor, Syntec, announced that they had this very same idea. Their former lead scientist, a man I fired for his lack of imagination, Robert Jennings, claims to have developed it himself. This is a lie. The room erupted. Harrison held up a hand for silence. Mr. Jennings did not develop this idea. He ridiculed it. He called it unscientific gibberish and a nursery rhyme. The idea for our Trojan Horse project came from the 12-year-old daughter of one of our janitorial staff. The room exploded again. Harrison turned. I'd like you to meet the real inventor of this technology. Please welcome Ms. Abigail Miller and her mother, our new director of Inspired Solutions, Susan Miller. Susan and Abby walked onto the stage into a storm of camera flashes. Susan held her daughter's hand, her head high. Abby, clutching her great-grandfather's book, looked out at the sea of faces with a simple, solemn curiosity. Harrison knelt beside her. Abby, he said into the microphone, can you tell these people what you told me? Abby's clear voice carried a surprising authority. I told them they were building a submarine. They should have built a fish. Or a friend. She held up the book. My great-grandfather was a soldier. He wrote that the best way to get past a guard is to wear a friendly face. She opened the book to the page. A camera zoomed in, projecting the faded text and the elegant, handwritten note onto the giant screen behind them for the entire world to see. The story was undeniable. It was perfect. It had the one thing Robert Jennings's lie didn't, a soul. It was a story of a hero, a mother's struggle, and a child's brilliant, inherited wisdom. Against that, a thief's complicated jargon stood no chance. The narrative exploded. The tale of the Maid's 500 IQ daughter was infinitely more compelling than the story of a disgruntled scientist. Abby became an overnight folk hero. For Syntech, it was a public relations apocalypse. Their stock plummeted. Facing a tidal wave of public outrage, their CEO fired Jennings and retracted the patent, blaming the deplorable actions of their former employee. The war was over. The truth had won. 6 months later, the late afternoon sun cast warm stripes across the floors of the newly christened Eleanor Coal Wing. The first human trials of the Trojan Horse, now officially Project Eleanor, were scheduled to begin next month, years ahead of schedule. Harrison stood by his office window, watching the city lights twinkle. Susan Miller walked in, carrying a folder. She was no longer a ghost in these halls, but moved with a quiet confidence, the guardian of the company's new culture. Her department had become a hub of innovation, a place where no idea was dismissed. The final schematics for the production model, Harrison, she said warmly. Thank you, Susan, he replied. They stood in comfortable silence, colleagues and friends. Down in the lobby, Abby was showing a security guard a passage in her great-grandfather's book. She was still a 12-year-old girl who loved old books, but now, the world listened when she spoke. Her future, once a narrow path, was an open field of endless possibility. Harrison looked from the folder in his hand, the culmination of his wife's memory and a child's wisdom, to the woman standing beside him. He had been saved not by a formula, but by a story. He had learned that the greatest walls are not built of scientific problems, but of pride, and that sometimes the only way to break through is to be humble enough to listen to a voice from a place you never thought to look, a voice that speaks a simple, timeless truth. You don't need a bigger sword. You just need a better disguise. A friendly face. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.